Welcome everyone to CG seminar number 181. This webinar replaces another advertised webinar and it was called at 2 days notice. So naturally we've got a lot of registrations, over 200, which goes to show that the less marketing you do, the more interest you create, or does it? When I told my wife, who also works in higher education studies, that the topic of today's webinar was, what is higher education studies? She started laughing. And I said to her, this is no laughing matter, or is it? We've got 210 registrations, plus perhaps people have checked in because they want to be amused. Anyway, we've got 6 people who will inform, amuse, and engage you on the topic of what is our field, what is our research field, what is it attempting to achieve, what are its uses, what are its applications. And those 6 people are, in speaking order, Paul Ashwin, who is a co-investigator in our program, but he's also a professor of education at Lancaster University and head of Department of Educational Research there. Golo Henseke, who's a research associate in our program, but also works at UCL and specialises in graduate employment and unemployment. Laurillard, professor of learning with digital technologies. I think I have it right, Diana. Mm-hmm. In the UCL Knowledge Lab, again, in our one of our designated researchers, has a history, including a position of head of e-learning strategy unit at the Department of Education and Schools in UK, pro vice-chancellor for learning technologies at the Open University, and a distinguished author in relation to online applications of higher education. Xin Xu, at the other end of her career, she's at a research associate at the University of Oxford, where she graduated DPhil at the beginning of 2020 and is active in our program. And Minto Felix, who's at even earlier stage in career terms, is doing a DPhil at Oxford, valued colleague of mine, also from Australia, and an expert, I think we can say, Minto, on policy, on applications of higher education studies to policy. And we have David Mills, who's a colleague of mine at Oxford, again, a co-investigator in our program, associate professor in pedagogy and the social sciences, and distinguished for his work on Africa, on education and development, a valued critical scholar in those domains. So we have a good range from people who work on learning and teaching aspects like Diana and Paul, Golo, who looks at the employment of graduates, Minto, who knows about policy, Xin, who works on science and research, and David, who works on the international space and the applications of education to development. So that enables, I think, many different domains of higher education studies to come into play. Each person is going to speak for 5 minutes, and then we'll go straight into the Q&A, where we expect we'll have a lot of activity from you, the participants.
So I was quite excited about this. After all, I've actually yet to publish a paper in a journal with a focus on higher education studies. So I can maybe add a kind of naive perspective from somebody who's not necessarily on the inside. So some economists would say economics is what economists do. And can we say the same about higher education studies? Is higher education studies what scholars of higher education studies do? And it probably doesn't work. In the research that I do as part of CGHE, I examine changes in graduate labor markets. I look at graduates, their earnings and job destinations, and differences in these outcomes within graduates and differences between graduates and non-graduates. And that's quite macro level stuff. Higher education in this particular context is an individual attribute, and it's rather the subject is rather than the subject of study. Higher education is more something that endows people with something that is valued or perhaps not valued in the labor market. In more recent years, I have become more interested in the redistributive power of higher education. So the expansion of higher education has not only changed the number of students and graduates, but also actually shapes the distribution of labor market opportunities, whether somebody attended university or not. So if higher education has become gatekeeper to decent work, higher education studies can ultimately reach beyond the narrow focus on immediate stakeholders, could include other people that are affected by higher education, although they are not necessarily taking part or are transformed, shaped by higher education. To better understand how my perspective on higher education studies fits into the wider field and its contribution, I had to look at the webinar topics CG platformed in 2020 and have prepared a little word cloud that I'm going to share with you. This should be this one. So basically looked at the title and abstract of stuff people have talked about on the seminars on the webinars last year. And it's actually quite a lot, a large corpus of words. 70,500 words of content was already on the website, just by titles and abstracts. And this word cloud gives, if you can see it, and I hope you can, gives a very, can you see the word cloud?
Yes.
Okay. Gives a very dense summary of what research topics and issues CG deemed worthwhile to talk about in 2020. And what sticks out for me from this picture is a little surprise, the central focus on higher education. Next we have like the constituent parts of higher education and its stakeholders. There's university mentioned, students, academics, graduate and institution systems or sectors. The pandemic is definitely something that has come up a lot, and COVID left a strong, a little surprise there. We also like to talk about research a great deal. There's true to form for CG. There's a central topic of the global and international countries and so forth. Nation is less frequent, and regions come up too, but it's not that prominent a topic. If you look at across places, we can find China and India frequently mentioned. Europe not as much. There's frequent mentioning of the social and the public, much more than we talk about the private. Funding and tuition are also concerns, but they're not so central. Thinking about government and policies around higher education is definitely has been a central theme. And we are concerned with the impact and role. So if you look at this, impact comes up there as a rather frequently mentioned word. What surprised me perhaps most when I looked at this picture is that inequality or equity concerns haven't been more central in our discussion of higher education in 2020. And that's maybe a starting point for discussion later on. And that's actually it for me.
Thanks, Golo. And can we bring in Diana? I'm going to have another go to at bringing in Paul after you, Diana.
Okay. Now I've lost you. Oh dear, I'm so sorry. What have I done? It's gone.
So what is higher education studies starts to take on an interesting meaning with all these connection problems and hesitancies and pauses.
It's lurking there behind one of my screens. I do apologize. So that's one I want to share that.
Thanks, Diana.
Things
are happening.
Yeah, but weird things are happening at my end. So I do apologize. Just let me introduce, are you seeing that screen?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to be focusing on this area and given the kinds of really difficult ideas that we were asked to address here, I've tried to think about this in the framework of the Deering Commission back in 1997, which proposed these 4 areas, which were the purpose of higher education. And I think within these primary issues, which higher education has to focus on as its main goals for teaching, research, contributing to the economy, and shaping a democratic, civilized, and inclusive society. It helps us to give some kind of orientation to our research. And I think we can fit probably the majority of our research topics in there, and we will see that as people talk today. But as we think about what we're doing in the context of technology, what we've been trying to do is to look at the sense in which technology has a role to play in the context of higher education in all these different respects. So I'm going to make some debatable claims here. I wonder if you could just give me a minute, if I could. No, I better not take the time. And so what we're thinking about is for each of the different areas of higher education research, we're trying to say, what kind of contribution could digital technology make? And my claim here is that within whatever kind of higher education research study you're doing, you could extend it into a whole new area by asking of it, what kind of contribution could digital technology make? And if we think in terms of the 4 areas of focus for higher education, then the research one has been extraordinary, because for some decades, research in universities has been making tremendous use of digital technology. And I think we've seen that especially over the last year. If you think of what would have happened to the pandemic if there hadn't been that online collaboration in research across the globe, through scientists sharing their ideas and sharing experimentation, sharing data and analysis and so on, then an economy, a world economy that had only physical communication connections would have had an absolutely disastrous effect of a pandemic, results from a pandemic. So it's certainly within research, I think higher education has made excellent use of technology. But then if we ask the same question of teaching, and we say, in that context, how well have we used technology? And really, we've had it for some decades now. We should have made a better fist of being able to make the most of what technology offers. And certainly, if you think of what we're teaching, if you're interested in curriculum, if you're interested in pedagogy or assessment, in all of those areas, you can ask the question, what contribution could digital technology make? And just to take one of those, in the curriculum, we now have to prepare our students for a world in which every single discipline has to understand how to use digital information and how to communicate digitally across their subject, across their communities, across the world. So our job now is to prepare students in every discipline. I don't think there's a single one that could be missed out for a digital world, and that's now critical. So we need that kind of research to be done. And then the issue of how we contribute socially, how we create that inclusive and democratic and civilized world. I think there another framework is valuable, which is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And for each of those, we can think again of ways in which we can extend the impact of university research by every single one of those 17 goals by using online education. But we don't necessarily know how to make that work. If you think about the impact that all of our university research needs to make, it's through millions of professionals all over the world who need to know about those findings and how to use them. So we need research on understanding how to actually do that, given that we do have the technology. How do we really make the best possible use of it? But then there's another issue which comes up in relation to this, which is that in this particular area, anybody thinking of going into looking at this has to think about the kind of methodology we'd be using. And in this case, what we're trying to do is to find ways of improving what we currently do with technology. Now, there's a perfectly good area of research which says, how good is the technology already that we're using? And you can do that. But when you're saying what is the potential of it, then you're really talking about something which doesn't yet exist. So we need a different kind of research methodology, which is design research methods, which create an intervention, test it, experiment with it, report back on it, improve it, and so on. So it's not really scientific research that's trying to understand the way the world is. It's much more like engineering research, which is trying to make the world a better place. We build design knowledge. So if you're thinking of going into this kind of research area, it's very important to decide what kind of research do you really want to do? Is it really science or is it really engineering? So I'm sorry I went over my time, Simon. I'm sorry about the glitch.
Diana, that's posed a really useful choice for us, hasn't it? Engineering research applications, usefulness, building things, designing things, making things work, making them safe. And on one hand, and on the other hand, fundamental investigation science questions we don't know the answer to, and so on. So that's something I think we'll return to during this discussion. I'm going to make another attempt now to bring in Paul. Paul, most welcome if you can now join us. Can you do so?
Can you hear me this time, Simon?
Yes, Paul.
Okay, so I'll leave my camera off just in case that's causing a problem. So what I was saying in relation to the field of higher education studies is that really it's a field of inquiry. This is its great strength because it means we have many diverse disciplinary, methodological and conceptual approaches, but it's also its great weakness because it means that we lack synoptic overviews of what those different approaches give us as a whole. So for example, this means that we can have a situation where we have government reports saying there's no agreed definition of teaching excellence, even though we have 50 years of research that says the same thing about what high quality teaching consists of. And so that lack of what those bodies of knowledge tell us collectively is a weakness of the diversity of approaches. In terms of where we go in the future, my view is that we need to shift from universities as the dominant unit of analysis for the field of higher education to focus far more on systems. Universities are incredibly noisy institutions that draw attention to themselves wherever they can, but we're at a historical moment where higher education systems are probably much more important, and we know far less about how these systems work effectively. So as I've said, we know a great deal about what creates high quality learning at a degree and an institutional level, but we don't know about how you construct a higher education system to support the learning of all students. And this has really important implications because this positions quality very much in terms of what universities and what individual academics and students do, rather than how systems create quality, how systems create inequalities as well. And so it's really important that we start to think at a system level about how issues of, in my case, the thing I'm really interested in, educational quality is created at a system level, because this has such profound implications for social justice, equality, and also the contributions that graduates make to society. And as I've wasted a lot of time mucking around, I shall leave it there.
No, don't apologise, Paul. We all go through these problems with Zoom from time to time, and I mean I've had significant connection problems from my place as well. I thought your point about institutions and moving away from that as the unit of analysis, the noisy university dominates the landscape in the field. Absolutely right. And I've had the same thoughts in my own work. One way is to move towards the system level, which tells us a lot because systems are relational sets of institutions. The other way is to think about learning and knowledge, and to, as you do, and to move towards the domain of learning communities and to look at what happens. I mean, active network theory says people plus technology now, non-human subjects as well as human subjects. But I think we can put into that mix, we can add to people plus technology, we can add knowledge and talk about learning networks and look at what happens. And that takes us into both teaching and learning on one hand and research on the other. Let me at this stage say thank you to Paul for persevering, and a welcome to Xin.
Thank you, Simon. I'll share my screen now. Yeah, so thank you, Simon, and previous speakers for the fantastic presentations. I will share some of my thoughts on this really difficult question. So my understanding of the higher education studies as a field is multiverse or pluriverse. I'll use the terms interchangeably, and they both mean that the possibility of the existence of different worlds within the world we're living. So not only multiple perspectives on looking at the one world we're living. And this implies multiple ontologies, multiple epistemologies, multiple ways of living and knowing. There are multiple identifiers for the different spaces within higher education studies. For instance, in the spatial terms, we have global, regional, national, or institutional containers, which are frequently used in the framing of higher education studies when we look at, for instance, higher education studies in the UK, in EU, in Africa, or in different research centers or research institutions. And they're also agents within higher education and higher education studies. And they kind of clustered around different disciplinary, cultural, language, theoretical metrics or constellations, as we can see in the galaxy, in the universe. There are also temporal dimensions of higher education studies. For instance, the contemporary higher education studies were the historical ones in certain periods. And there are so many different characteristics of the multiverse of higher education studies, which I'm trying to navigate with and try to problematize. So to start with, it's a multiplexed, which means that it can be looked at multiple angles and from multiple dimensions. For instance, if you look at the figure on the right-hand side, perhaps you can see a duck's hat or a rabbit's hat, or you can see both. So any of the perspectives are right. And that is also the existence of the multiverse in higher education studies. And also in terms of each individual spaces, they are diversified, but they also share similar ideas, similar themes of studies. For instance, as we can see on the word cloud Golo has showed us, there are like recurring themes within higher education studies, no matter which discipline backgrounds you're from. The relationships between the spaces are dynamic and always changing, and they can operate individually, but there's always possibility of intersecting with each other or connecting with each other. And with this kind of interactions between the spaces, the higher education spaces is open and growing infinitely. But we should also note that the multiverse is unequal itself. It's dominated by some hegemonical powers, and there's this tendency to be like othering each other or othering who are different. As we can see from the multi-analysis on higher education studies, they review the dominance of, for instance, the EU, Euro-American institutions, journals, publications, thoughts, paradigms within this field, and also these studies, which often draw on Euro-American databases and evidences and English publications, somehow in turn reinforced this kind of dominance of these spaces, because we're learning more about these spaces, but not other spaces. And to continue with the third characteristic, I argue that some spaces are more visible to more audiences, whereas some others are unseen or silenced or marginalized. However, they do exist in the multiverse. Perhaps they are fading away into the black hole, or they exist at the black matters. They may be invisible, but they are of the same importance. So here's the question of agency. So here's a question of who can produce knowledge and who can legitimize and codify those knowledge, and who have the right to engage with or even to replace certain kind of knowledge. And this is not just about knowledge we're talking about in higher education studies. It's about the value, the agenda, and the reality that people are living within higher education and higher education studies. These kind of questions are raised in many critiques already, particularly on the monoculture and the hegemony in global research, particularly in social sciences research, and at times in higher education studies. And this is also the body of literature that calls for the cognitive justice, epistemic justice, democratization, and pluralization of knowledge and research. And often they came from the post-colonial, non-English speaking, non-Euro-American perspectives. So I'm not sure how much this is going within higher education studies field. And I'm not sure whether this kind of imagination of the multiverse echoes some of your perspectives or your imagination of the field. And this may sound a bit like idealistic. And if I may sound like a dreamer, I hope I'm not the only one. So with this note, I'll end my presentation. I look forward to more discussions. Thank you.
Thanks, Xin. That's very elegant. I think Paul's point about us being a field of inquiry has really helped. And I think that helps us unite the two halves of Diana's dualism, the engineer and the scientist, because they're both engaged in inquiry. And those inquiries might have a greater synergy than perhaps the applications do. But Paul's other challenge is to think about multiplicity, which of course is what Xin has just been talking about, including the multiplicity involved in subaltern voices and the inside-outside dualism of people who are completely excluded from the conversation, who should be centrally part of the conversation. And the challenge that Paul makes is that, well, yes, we've got diversity and multiplicity, diversity of disciplines, approaches, themes, topics, people, agents, but we also have the need to develop synoptic concepts, core things that pull it together, give it a common meaning across some of these divisions, including the inside-outside dualism that Xin has ably talked about. Let me bring in Minto at this stage. Welcome, Minto, to your first CG webinar presentation.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, everybody. And it's great to be here with you. I'm going to share my screen. And as you note, Simon, it is my first time. So I'm just going to stick to some pre-prepared remarks, if that's all right, just so I stick to time. So thanks, everyone. Among the many and varied intellectual contributions of higher education studies, for me, the field illuminates two really important features. One, the inequalities experienced by people and groups that we see in wider society, yet at the same time, it also demonstrates potential for positive change and growth. I believe that we see these threads reflected in four major areas of inquiry that occupy the focus of higher education studies: students, the academic worker, in national development, and in global relations. Thinking about students, I'm reminded of the work of scholars such as Vicky Bolivar here in the UK, who highlights the differences in students' income backgrounds and how that shapes which institutions they are able to attend. Or of Kahinde Andrew, who calls for the dismantling of racism and colonisation in higher education. At the global level, and as Xin has just excellently explained, higher education studies can explain the dominance of the English language in journal publications and what this means for the voices that are heard and the knowledges that are communicated, but more importantly, what it also means for those that go unheard. Or of the impact of different resourcing structures and policies on academic stability and independence to undertake scholarly work. Yet on the other hand, bodies of work such as Transforming Universities for a Changing Climate, engaged in Tristan McCowan, who's affiliated with CG, underscores the crucial role higher education institutions, in this case universities, can play in addressing global challenges and in responding to movements such as the Sustainable Development Goals. As well, the continuing body of literature and growing number of empirical works which harness the self-formation theory that explores the expansion of agency and freedoms which can be realised through participation in higher education have implications not only for students, but as we've heard through Paul and others, pedagogy, mode of educational delivery, and the way that higher education institutions are designed. Such complex challenges that traverse all domains of the human, social, and indeed environmental conditions cannot be tackled by one discipline or method alone. I think I'm in agreement with some of the other speakers. The field by its nature needs to draw on plurality. And as a scholar, as a new scholar to the field, this is perhaps one of the most exciting aspects of working in this field. Political science, history, sociology, economics, and more expand and diversify the perspectives through which we come to understand higher education studies, the questions that are framed, and the theorizations that can be developed. Plurality must also shape the future of this field, which is why institutions like centres like CG are so vital in bringing together researchers and perspectives from various disciplinary and cultural traditions. Turning our attention then to burning questions, the nesting of higher education systems within the state and wider structures and the tensions and interactions that exist between these entities is of enormous interest to me. In my own research context, that is the issue of research culture in India, unpacking the interactions between disciplinary research cultures, institutional cultures, and the wider regional and national political culture in which disciplines and institutions are set. But there are many others where the interactions between politics, policy, and the purposes of higher education need to be seriously scrutinised. Another burning area for me concerns the evolving academic worker, the working conditions and modes they experience, the resources they have at their disposal, the barriers they face. In addition to teaching and research staff, postdoctoral students, I think here we must also concern ourselves with the vast numbers of professional and administrative services staff which make up higher education institutions. Higher education, the employer, is an area requiring further empirical examination. Lastly, the theoretical and explanatory contributions of higher education studies has been so powerful, yet I think we can do more to ensure that the field of inquiry and its works translates more readily to shape the everyday policies and practices of governments, institutions, individuals, and others. this should more overtly shape the focus of higher education scholars and the work they undertake. And with that, I thank you for your time and pause.
And thank you for that amazing preparation, Minto, at 2 days' notice. That was terrific presentation. Our final speaker is David Mills. David.
Great. Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you all for great presentations. I guess I'm going to try and link some of this together, but in my 5 minutes on the soapbox, I'll just try and say 3 things. So first, responding to Simon's prompt, to reflect a bit on the thinginess of this field. What sort of thing is this field? And then a bit on our entanglement with our object of study, and finally a couple of challenges for the field. So first, what is this thing? Is it, as Peter Gallison would describe, a trading zone, a space where different expertises and perspectives hustle for attention? Is it, to quote Mary Louise Pratt, a contact zone, where research, policy and practice meet and clash, a noisy contestation of paradigms? Or is it, to use a Deleuzean metaphor, a bit like higher education itself, a rickety teaching and research assemblage that's currently constantly being taken apart and put back together again? So are we an academic Humpty Dumpty? So now, I'm not going to say which of these metaphors is most useful. I think they're all useful, because they do remind us that we're in a sort of fragile, unstable, somewhat provisional field. And it's a dynamic system, which makes it impossible to find one place from which to objectively stand back and examine higher education as a single stable entity, as I think everyone's already argued. So that takes me to my second point. How are we entangled then with our object of study? What are our values? So as researchers, we're clearly invested in the future of the university. It's a place for research into what Wendy Brown calls worldly predicaments. We're also all teachers. So similarly, we see universities as playing a role in developing publicly oriented knowledge. Ellie Thorkelson talks about this as academography, okay, where we can't not be disinterested in what we're doing. And so inevitably we have to think then about how the knowledge we create it is also value laden. It has political, epistemological and ideological values. So I think we've got to be explicit about that and explicit about our commitments to the university as an ideal and a practice. And I guess that's sort of implicit in some of the prompts Simon gave. He asked us to talk about the burning issues that must be addressed, the core mission of the field. So that leads me to a normative question. Amongst our own values and commitments, does our field have a commitment to sustaining the institutional relationship in some form between research and teaching within higher education? Because I think that is quite core to understanding what we think this field is. So then what are the challenges ahead? I just got a couple of challenges for us to think about. One is, I carry on. One is mass quantification, and I think Diana pointed to some of this. What happens when some forms of knowledge are metricized? Does that mean that if we can measure things more easily, like research, we should study it more than studying teaching, which isn't as easy to measure or value, though of course Paul would say we know a lot about it. A second then challenge for us is the post-colonial transformations of higher education. And this is something that Xin has raised. Perhaps the first World University Rankings of 2003 were the high point for realizing an object of study called the global higher education system and a field of global higher education studies. Perhaps the future is one of many higher education studies, in the same way as people in anthropology talk about world anthropologies. Will we have world higher education studies, each of which are oriented to the concerns of particular regional knowledge systems, ecosystems? So I think both of those are questions for me that highlight our field is changing, and there's an awful lot to play for. And I'd like to thank Simon for bringing us together to start this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, David. There's much there to think about. Colleagues, so we're now moving to the Q&A. I'm aware that we need to be able to bring the panel in to the Q&A at some point. And I think what we'll do is we'll ensure that we have time for wrap up for across the panel with a minute each at the end. So even if panel members don't come into the next 20, 25 minutes, you will have the chance to say something right on the dot of 3 o'clock UK time. Now, folks, it's time to put your questions forward. As we always do, we select the Q&A from the chat. So I'd say that write your questions out now. We've had a number of interesting contributions that haven't necessarily become questions. I've been chatting to those who've been who put them forward and asked them if they want to come in as Q&As, but they're not there yet. But if you are asked to speak in the Q&A, you turn on your microphone. Most important step. Turn on your video, because it's better if we can see you when you ask your question, and then please state who you are, where you're from. So what do we now see in the chat? Anyone prepared to come in? Because if not, I'm going to ask Diana and Paul to go over the ground which they were going over in the chat during the presentations. Diana, could you put forward on camera and for recorded purposes, of course, and on YouTube, your question of Paul?
Yes, Paul, you were talking about quality, which we all believe is extremely important. We've had quite a lot of experience at the level of teaching. It's always been rather process oriented, never really got to the real substance of it, and your work has done a lot to illuminate that, I think. But now you're talking about quality at education system level. What kinds of measures would those be? What would they be like? What would they push us to?
Yeah, thanks, Diana. I mean, yeah, it's a really good question. My kind of attempt of it is that we think about what features of a system appear to support or inhibit the educational success of all students across that system. And that probably pushes us to think more in terms of tertiary systems than simply higher education systems. There's a great comment in the chat from Mike Ratcliffe about thinking about systems and not just getting drawn into elite higher education. And part of the reason that the focus on institutions is so problematic is it tends to be very particular institutions as if they represent quality, rather than thinking about the educational quality that's offered for all students in tertiary education and how that benefits the whole of society. So it would be trying to identify different features of a system and variations across national systems and trying to work out where they appear to support or inhibit high quality education for all.
Great answer, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Mike Ratcliffe.
So thank you, Simon. And I think Paul's just picked up on that I think one of the things higher education studies can do for policy is to try and make sure that it looks across the range of institutions, because there are some institutions that really do hog a lot of the attention, and also try to give people a much broader range of field and to also bring some discipline to it. There was a lecture last night that Michael Barber gave, and there was a raging row on Twitter about some of his sources, and just because people were pointing out that he was very selective in what he was picking up, very trying to prove that there's a freedom of speech problem in higher education. There are lots of people kind of shouting and saying, "Oh, no, can you put that into context, please?" So I think it's about bringing that discipline to otherwise lazy interpretations of higher education, which particularly could be a problem when you're dealing with government policy, which does seem to be. Apparently, Gavin Williamson's just had another pop at media studies in launching things today, and lots of us will have our heads in our hands in despair at the data that doesn't underpin that, and a lot of Daily Mail articles that do.
Thanks, Mike. We had a very nice point made by Elil Cohen in the chat about Dewey, and Elil, I'm wondering if you would like to come in at this point.
Hello. Hi, thank you, Simon. Yeah. So yeah, I didn't know if I could find a way of directly asking as a question directly to anyone in particular, but yeah. So it's just for me that that little brief, really interesting interchange between Simon and Paul earlier around shifting focus to things like systems, learning communities, the nature of different forms of knowledge, and how these different communities, depending on their goals, relate to knowledge. And then the relation between that and different objects, whether that's natural objects or technologies. It just sounds like there is potentially something there to look back on, kind of the traditional theories that we have of education. And particularly John Dewey came to mind, seems to have written a lot about things which link all of these things together, particularly in his book Democracy and Education, and also his less read book, his final work was Knowing and the Known. He talked about things like social efficiency, about the transactional approach to humanity's approach to developing knowledge, which I think was actually a big inspiration for actor network theory that Simon mentioned. So I just wonder if either Dewey or if there are any other kind of key authors that come to mind when we are trying to think about this new shift to something a bit more kind of holistic approach to not just the almost university studies, but truly higher education or advanced learning kind of studies.
Any member of the panel like to pick that up? Mm-hmm. Well done, Elil. You've completely floored the panel. This is a good thing about higher education studies, is that we're not always certain of the answers, and we're still inquiring.
I can say something briefly, Simon.
Please do, Paul.
Which is, I think, what that really nicely highlights is a kind of lost focus on what it means for universities and higher education institutions and tertiary education institutions to educate people, and that, and that's in Dewey's work, and it's also in Gert Biester's work. This actual sense of, we've kind of got so wrapped up within the kind of educational subfield of higher education into teaching and learning and graduate outcomes, but actually what that education means and what it means to offer an education is something that's kind of got lost in many of the debates we've been having. And I certainly plan to go and look at Knowing and the Known, because that's not something I've read before.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I've now got a call list, I'm pleased to say, and we've got Amir Pichardis, John Biggs, Claudia Serico in that order. And I think we'll take Ryan Wilkinson as well after that. So Amir.
Yeah, yes, hi, thank you. I turned off the camera so that there isn't a transmission problem, but in terms of focusing on the role of higher education, as we know, higher education explores different aspects of higher education. That includes developing an understanding of how people learn and accordingly how they should be taught. And therefore, one could reasonably say that insights from higher education studies could inform how learning and teaching should be approached in other disciplines in higher education. Now, the problem is that in other disciplines, academics may overlook or ignore these insights. This problem can be exemplified by approaches that are traditionally taken, for example, in law schools. As some of you may know, law schools have traditionally focused on a doctrinal approach, which focuses on exposing students to substantive law and expecting them to analyze and apply the law to hypothetical facts. Now, students therefore end up coming out of law school learning about receiving, memorizing, analyzing, and applying legal information. And by the end of their studies, they could be expected to have accumulated information about the substantive law. Also, they'll be expected to have acquired skills necessary to analyze and apply the law which they have learned. And this reflects and facilitates what, as many of you will have known, is the cognitivist approach to learning about how people learn. Now, the problem is, and some of it I think it was addressed, but the problem is that knowledge of a set of laws covered in law school and the skills of analyzing the law is not enough to prepare students for legal practice. Law students need to be able to actively reconstruct their analysis of new laws and beyond that which they covered in law school, and they can't rely just on previously acquired information. They also need to be able to develop other relevant soft skills such as teamwork and giving legal advice, which they can only gain from practical experience. Now, this need to actively reconstruct their knowledge and application of the law and to gain relevant skills that they can apply. This reflects a constructivist view of learning. The problem is that this constructivist approach is not really taken into account in practice in many law schools. And
we need to finish up because it's a long question and we need to move on.
Yeah. Yeah, so the potential role of insights from learning theories can be facilitative for other disciplines, and that's something that is not actively taken into account and should be, and you can see that being acknowledged to some extent, and I think that is something that should be acknowledged more in practice. And
what I'm going to do, folks, at this point is, because we've got a call list, and we also want to bring the panel back through to respond to the webinar as a whole. So I'm going to instead of asking you, panel members to respond to each individual question, I'm going to take a run of questions from 4 people, and then we'll go around the panel. Okay. So our next on the call list is John Biggs. Can I ask colleagues who are coming in now to try and be succinct, please?
Hi, can you hear me okay? Yep. I can be very succinct and just say, what do the panel think the under-researched aspects of higher education studies are at a range of levels, individual, members of staff, institutions, systems, they can take their pick.
Good, thanks, John. That's very succinct, as you said. Claudia Sarrico.
I just wanted to contribute to that debate of what needs to be done, and that we should be looking more at the system level, which I would like to concur. And when we look at the quality of higher education, of course, you know, there's the rankings, but those represent, I estimate, around 10% of the institutions that publish on international referee journals. And so we also have a huge amount of tertiary education, which is non-higher education, that is growing. And so I think there's a lot of scope to look at the system level. But I think there's also a lot of data, because Diana was asking, what do we have? And so at OECD, for instance, the survey of adult skills actually gives a lot of information on learning outcomes, on social outcomes, on labor market outcomes, and of university graduates, of higher education graduates, tertiary graduates, but also you can see differences across generations and the evolution across generations. And this has been done in 2012. Now it will come out again in 2022. So I think it's just to concur that I think we should look at the system level rather than the institution, or in addition to the institution. That's it.
Claudia. John Wilkinson.
Oh, hi, it's Ryan Wilkinson. I'm from a very rainy, cold, it's okay, rainy, cold Manchester Metropolitan University. Yeah, Diana mentioned something that really struck home with me about the societal benefit of higher education. And I think that sometimes, particularly in our current moment, and perhaps over the last 10 years with the increased marketisation of higher education in the UK, and how that's impacted and reframed education as being an individualised pursuit. And also with the current context of the pandemic and the issues around value for money that students are getting at the moment. I just wondered what the panel thought about how we can use higher education studies to recognise the more qualitative nature of the benefits to society as a whole.
Thanks, Ryan. Our next contribution is from Lauren Boltz. Good to see you, Lauren.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren. I'm from the US, but I'm studying at Oxford right now. I had a question kind of following on from Ryan's about how education is an individualized pursuit now, and how you would advise a student on whether they should specialize in higher education or in, say, another subject with a focus on higher education, and then bringing that larger, how you would conceptualize that, how that would like fit into how you conceptualize the field.
Okay, I hope panel members, you're keeping these questions in mind. Our next question is from Rob Cuthbert. Hi, Rob. Hello, Rob.
Yes, hello, Simon. Hi. Sorry, I was really meaning to just chip into the chat, but I just by serendipity came across an article on the performance of higher education systems today, and by a couple of guys working out of Italy in a journal I'd never come across called Regulation and Governance, and that looked at institutional autonomy, evaluation, internal governance, and public funding, and said institutional autonomy is much less significant in terms of performance than people think. That was the proposition. So I'd just like to get the panel's response to that.
And there's quite a bit of evidence on that in the science literature too, that the institutional domain is less important than, you know, what happens at the discipline and departmental academic unit level. Our next question is from Kudos Silisili.
Hi, Simon. It's Horsey. Sorry about that. Just a quick question. I think Claudia already touched on it. I just wanted to understand from the panel what they feel like the role of introduction of just university rankings has had on the overall sort of system and the way in which institutions now, choose to prioritize certain things. Has it been positive? Has it been negative? Or has it not done anything at all? Yeah, thanks.
Rankings question, and certainly something that plays into higher education studies a lot in terms of practical scholarship and the interventions that people make in the real higher education world. Bala, you're back again. Good to see your name in the chat. Would you like to ask your question?
Okay, sure. Thank you. What I see is that historically, in the development of disciplines, there is a community of practice supported by a range of things such as the publications, such as examination boards, such as again the curriculum, etc. With higher education, I think it is a sort of a multidisciplinary field cohering into a discipline. So in that sense, it's in a historical phase. And the research I did to co-edit a book on interdisciplinary learning and teaching in higher education, published by Routledge, we noticed that the idea of a discipline and multi or interdisciplinary development is a historical phenomenon. And what we are seeing in higher education is a development, the birth of a new discipline. And therefore, we have to, if we want to support that, we need to do a systematic scaffolding of different aspects to support the development of the discipline. For example, the REA, the research assessment exercise, which drives a lot of research in UK universities, is one area. We do not have a higher education studies category for that. Same with the Times Higher, or the ranking, the QS ranking. They do not still consider, or at least at this point, consider it as a separate entity, like, for example, civil engineering or things like that. So, what the panel thinks we should do to speed up the development of the discipline. Thank you.
Nice question. Thanks, Bala. I'm going to take one more. Qingling Kong will have the final question stroke statement, and then we'll go to the panel and we'll take the panel in reverse order. So we'll begin with David. So Qingling, are you there?
Thank you very much. Yes. Thank you very much for all the thought-provoking talks. As you actually promised, I'm informed, amused in a very inspired way, and now try to engage with the Q&A. I work on higher education projects in 10 developing countries in Africa. And I joined the seminar today really out of a personal interest in how higher education studies contribute to development initiatives. Actually, I've enjoyed working with scholars in project implementation, including last year with Ellen Hazelcorn from CGHE. And my question is pretty practical. The transformation of research results into operational development projects, which I myself am grappling with, working on higher education projects in Africa. I encounter lots of high quality researches, but often find myself constrained by contextual factors, political and cultural. If I may ask the question to Professor David Mail, given his interests and experiences in Africa, how could researchers and development initiatives speak better to each other in a mutually beneficial linkage? Thank you.
Thanks, Qingling. And good to be able to hand to David at this point. David, can you do your final statement and try to do it in a minute if you can?
Brilliant. A minute. I mean, there's so much has come up here, and quickly we'll have to come back and talk to you about this. I think what you highlight in your question is something that's come up again and again, which is the value of local knowledges of a higher education studies field that is informed by other disciplines. And lots of people have raised this question about this being an interdisciplinary field. We do need to not see ourselves, I don't think, simply as a new discipline, but as a special sort of field that is connected to other forms of knowledge. So if you're working in Africa, you clearly need to know a lot about the anthropology, the culture, the society, the economy of the higher education institution that you're working with. So for me, the message is one of reaching out rather than closing down.
Thanks, David. I think we'd all agree with that. Now we're going to go Minto, Xin, Diana, Golo, Paul. So Minto, you're next.
I would have answered Lauren's question, but I think Bala's done that brilliantly for us, and I would concur with his perspective. So in responding to Ryan's question, I think that it's all about how we define value, and that value, the value of higher education and the value that it delivers to community, society, individuals can be in many ways multiple forms, not just through individual economic returns, but indirect and more wider social benefit as well.
Well said, Minto. Xin.
Thank you for all the panelists and the audience and the engaging questions and answers. So from what I heard from the questions and discussions, there's this recurring themes about the higher education policies, higher education administration, and on the practical side, and also the values of academic researchers and the synergies between them. And also there's this diversification of knowledges from different perspectives of stakeholders, for instance, the practitioners, policymakers, and local perspectives. So my hope and message today would be that we keep diversifying higher education studies and higher education field. And the discussion today we had perhaps is one of the steps to move this forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Xin. And again, I think we're going to agree with you about that. Diana.
I'm going to just focus on two questions. The one from Claudia about whether it's important to study at the discipline level as well as across higher education. I think it is, because that detailed understanding of the local and the specific can inform the generic in ways that would otherwise remain hidden. So I think the discipline level is important. And then the first question we had, I'd forgotten who it was from, beautifully simple question, what is under-researched? And the great global issue that I find most disturbing, I think, at the moment is increasing inequality. And of course, I see that higher education and technology have a role to play in that. So I think that is one of the issues which I think is truly badly under-researched. And that helps to answer Ryan's question as well. We do have a lot of studies within HE on social inequality, and that's where the whole move towards widening participation came from. And we have widened participation in one sense. In another sense, we're still tragically unequal. And I think we have to go back as the pandemic has shown up in so many ways. And so I think we should be now going back with those urgent questions in mind of how we can reduce inequality further.
Thank you, Diane. Again, we're going to agree with you. And thank you for your contributions throughout the webinar today. Golo.
I think the seminar has really brought forward some very exciting questions around higher education studies. And my feeling is that it seems to be more a community of issues rather than practice at this stage. How we develop it, I'm not entirely sure, but it seems that we're very good at picking up issues and reacting to those and thinking about how they relate to higher education. In terms of this question, what is understudied, I feel sometimes that we have a very strong focus on higher education, and that the context in which higher education operates might, the wider context historically, but also in how it interacts with other systems, might be something that we could look at in more detail.
Yeah, agreed. I think we're rather internal in the way we treat higher education studies, and that relationality is really crucial in terms of understanding its social and global role. Paul, you've got the final contribution.
Thanks, Simon. Can you hear me this time?
Yeah.
So just a few points I want to make. First of all, in terms of the focus on systems, it's really important that we understand that as systems. so often that, there's plenty of research on higher education systems, but basically it treats institutions as if a system is a collection of institutions, and it's not. So, so for example, the research Rob mentioned, the moment you're talking about institutional autonomy, you're seeing institutions as a unit of analysis. A second point is that the question was raised about rankings. And in terms of rankings as measures of educational quality, they should be a source of shame for higher education. We know they're nonsense. Yes, we behave as if they're true. We basically use Orwell's notion of doublethink. We know they're nonsense, but we behave as if they're true. And for institutions responsible for looking after knowledge for society, that should be a source of eternal shame. And and institutions even pay for the rankings. Anyway, I could go on for that for ages. I won't. Thirdly, we really need to start focusing on higher education as part of society rather than separate from society. So often higher education is a black box into which things go, and then we look at how it impacts in society rather than taking it as a whole and saying, how does higher education fit within society? And finally, the question that we always need to come back to is, what is all this for? What are we trying to do with this research? What's the contribution we want to make? And kind of the question that Ryan raised kind of highlights that. And if what we're doing is supporting our own careers, writing lots of papers, but not actually making a contribution to help things improve, then I think we should question why we're doing it.
Yeah, I think what you've said about rankings is really good and really important, and everything you've said today has been very helpful, Paul. But I mean, we know something about higher education, but not enough about society, perhaps. Society knows little about us, and it tends to, it doesn't connect to our talk very well. We don't connect to it very well in our talk, and it uses things like rankings to try and get a handle on the problem, and then the problems begin. I think Paul's challenge at the beginning was to find synoptic concepts which draw together the sub-themes that we've been talking about today. And I think that challenge is still before us. I hope that by the time we're finished with the Centre for Global Higher Education, it's contributed to the development of overarching and synoptic concepts which help move everything forward in our thinking, and maybe move forward the social perception and social engagement with higher education as well. I mean, it seems to me that it involves a process of people forming themselves. I call this self-formation. There's a danger that that's seen as too exclusively individualistic. It's also a process of social formation. We contribute to the reproduction, development, and change in social relations around us, including the institutional forms that those social relations take. We have an immense impact, in fact, through the teaching and learning process, and also through the knowledge formation and dissemination process on the nature of society. But we don't conceive it quite like that, do we? So we need to acknowledge that there's self-formation and social formation going on. And it seems to me the hard issue is how they relate to each other and what kind of society we can commit to. Whatever else it will be, it'll be a more egalitarian and more equitable society, I think. And that's a core issue for all of us, equity, as it is that's one of the reasons why we work in education and on educational science and research problems. Equity is a major driver. So that I think is the one synoptic concept that we currently have to work with. But because it's only equity that we have to work with, we're not doing enough on other fronts. Thank you very, very much. We clearly need to return to this theme. We asked in a poll whether people would prefer this kind of discussion to take place over 90 minutes rather than 60 minutes. And I think it'll be a bit of a surprise to the Research Management Committee of CG that more people have opted for the 60 minutes than the 90 minutes, which says something about our format of 60 minutes being quite a workable one. I think it's user-friendly. People can come in for an hour and do that regularly, knowing it's not going to take over their lives, and they can quit after an hour. Maybe we need to keep doing that most of the time, but we are looking at developing some longer format webinars which would allow for more discussion. And today we could have brought in another 10 people, I'm sure, if we'd had the time. If it means sacrificing audience numbers but having a longer and more engaged discussion, it's probably worth doing. So we will be looking at some more varied formats in future, but we're going to keep running 60-minute webinars. You can be sure of that. We'll keep doing what we're currently doing, which seems to work for a lot of people around the world. Next webinar is Solomon Zawalde who's talking about race, ethnicity, cultural capital, and lived experience of international higher education. So international students, especially from Africa, the subject of Solomon's research. He's been a good contributor to our discussions so far on some of those issues in webinar format. And we really look forward to seeing what he will come up with next Tuesday for us. So thanks to everyone. Thanks for panel for coming in at 2 or 3 days notice. It was fabulous, your contributions today. Thanks, Paul, for persisting with the connection problems. And in the end, we got a lot of value from your contributions. That was great. And, you know, to our large audience today, come back again. Very welcome. And we'll continue the conversation about higher education studies, where it's going and what its uses are. Bye for now.
Bye for now. Thank you.